it to be done, it's going to be done. Right?
We all want it to be tomorrow.
I want it to be November 4th is what I really want. I got to tell you, I really want it to be November 4th. So, but that was
live now.
Okay, we're all set. Okay, very good. All right, I'm going to call the Tuesday, the Monday. See, the thing says Tuesday, November 2nd, so that's what threw me off on the agenda. So it is Monday, November 2nd. I am going to call the Monday, November 2nd Planning and Programming Committee meeting to order. We have, I believe, all members of the committee except for, we now have Councilmember Snyder. So we have everyone. So all members of the committee are present. We are going to begin by adopting the resolution that we circulated regarding our holding a virtual meeting. Is there a motion to approve this resolution, which states that because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the governor's state of emergency, that we are holding this meeting electronically, and due to the passage of the amendments in HB 29, the FOIA bill, which allowed regional bodies to hold their meetings electronically, we are doing so because right now it would be unsafe to do otherwise. So is there a motion to approve that resolution?
So moved.
There is a motion. I did not see who from that motion was from. Sorry, Mayor Rochelle. A motion by Mayor Rochelle, seconded by
I'll second. Yep.
Approve the resolution. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor of the resolution, please signal by saying aye.
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 Those say nay. The ayes have it. The resolution carries unanimously. We do have in your packet the summary notes that were from the September 29th meeting. Is there a motion to approve the meeting notes from September 29th?
So moved.
There's a motion by Chair Wheeler.
Second from Rochelle.
Seconded by Mayor Rochelle. Any further discussion on the meeting notes? Hearing none. All those in favor, please signal by saying aye.
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 Say nay. The ayes have it. The meeting notes are approved. All right. So at this point, we are going to go to the transaction vision and goals, which you all had, we discussed briefly last time, and we have circulated a proposal. And I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Jasper to brief us, and we'll have some discussion of the committee.
Thank you, Chair Wilson, members of the committee. Good evening. Exciting day, I'm sure, ahead for all of you and us, probably. I hope we'll be over and done with here fairly soon, but that depends on you. So we have a couple of things ahead of you this evening, one action item and the opportunity for some discussion, both related to transaction. Sri, if you could advance the slide, please. So, some of the information you're going to see at the front of this presentation you've seen previously, but wanted to include it again just for reference purposes. So when we talk about vision, goals, and ultimately objectives, performance measures, and weights, all of these things have a purpose in that it helps us to evaluate the performance of the transaction plan when we get to that point in a year probably from now. But the vision, goals, and objectives, etc., are all interconnected. So everything flows downhill from the vision. So we wanted to kind of get a jump start on the transaction process by hopefully having the authority approve the vision statement, which itself reflects kind of a very high level, very kind of idealized view of the future that the authority would like to head towards. And then the goals will build off the vision, the objectives will build off the goals, and the measures will build off the objectives, etc. So on this slide here, you'll see pretty much everything is grayed out, and that is just to reinforce the fact that while it's certainly legitimate to talk about goals, objectives, etc., this evening, the only action we're asking from you relates to the vision itself. there will be ample opportunity to discuss goals, etc., in the months ahead, and ultimately these will be finalised and approved by the authority later in 2021. And not until after we've had the opportunity for some public engagement as well, which obviously we'll share with you at the time. So tonight we just want to talk about the vision in terms of an action, but we do want to talk about some of the potential new topics for transactions. So Shri, if you would advance to the next slide. So this slide captures the entire vision, goals, objectives, measures, and weights for the measures for the current iteration of transaction, the one that was adopted by the authority in 2017, and which prevails to this date and will do so for another probably couple of years, and until it is replaced by the transaction update that we're talking about this evening. So this is all in place. There's not really anything to discuss here, but it's included in the packet for reference if you want to kind of come back and see what was approved previously compared to what we might be talking about in the future. Next slide, please, Shri. So there are three proposed new elements that we are looking to include in transaction this time around, and this does affect the vision that is being proposed that we'll talk about in just a moment. The first of these three proposed new elements is equity. We mentioned this at the last meeting, and I think there was broad agreement among members of the committee that equity must be explicitly addressed in transaction. And so just to kind of put a little definition, at least on how we're thinking about equity at the moment, equity speaks to fairness in mobility and accessibility to meet the needs of the region, sub-regions within the region, and indeed within the sub-regions, even individual communities, which could be quite numerous and kind of very kind of specific in area. Also, as part of equity, what we're trying to do is facilitate social and economic opportunities on an equitable basis across a broad range of folks who may currently be underserved for a range of reasons, some of which are listed in the second bullet here. The second new element that we're proposing speaks to sustainability. Sustainability for us is all about focusing on meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. In other words, when it comes to, say, Earth's resources, to look at using what we need, but without compromising, taking away any ability of the future generations to use the resources that they need as well. The concept of sustainability is sometimes kind of referred to in terms of three pillars, generally referred to here as economic, environmental, and social, and sometimes specifically called out as the three Ps, which would be profit, planet, and people. So in other words, sustainability is really trying to look at a bottom line which isn't simply driven by profit, but it is driven by other, social and environmental factors as well. And finally, the third proposed new element is resiliency, which speaks to the ability of the transportation system to move people around, even when there are major extreme obstacles to normal function of the system. And we've included here, but mostly we're talking about things which don't just take the system or parts of the system down for a couple of hours or even a couple of days, but potentially for a couple of weeks, months, or years, or permanently indeed. So resiliency is something that we think is something that given that transaction is updated on a 5-year cycle, as at this point in the 5-year cycle, it's appropriate to look at these things. It's not to say you or the authority have to include them, but we think there's value in considering the inclusion of one or more of these proposed new elements. Next slide, please. So assuming there is broad agreement to including these new elements, then the proposed vision that is before you is shown in the dark blue bar at the top of this slide, which reads: Northern Virginia will plan for and invest in a safe, equitable, sustainable, and integrated multimodal transportation system that enhances quality of life, strengthens the economy, and builds resilience. So you see the three proposed new components highlighted in yellow, and in addition, highlighted the word safe as well, since previous iterations of transaction, while they have addressed safety, we felt that for a couple of reasons that I get into in just a moment, that safety was something which was sufficiently important across the entire system that it justified inclusion in this proposed vision statement. Other than that, if you have the meeting packet on your screen, or if indeed you want us to, we can jump back a couple of slides and you can see how that proposed vision differs from the current vision. And I would say that it doesn't differ by a whole lot. Those 4 words that are highlighted are really the key changes. But the way that vision is structured will result in a rethink about the potential goals should this proposed vision be recommended by this committee and ultimately approved by the authority. And you can see on the left-hand side of the table, there are 3 potential goals. We're not asking for actions. I'm just saying these are potential. Certainly fair game to talk about these, but we are not looking for action this evening. But the potential goals that will support the proposed vision are shown, with the first goal speaking to enhancing quality of life, and that's really a mobility goal. The second potential goal speaks to the region's economy, and that's more of an accessibility goal. And then the third potential goal gets to the concept of resiliency. What you'll notice is the words safe, equitable, and sustainable do not appear in any of the potential goals, and I'll come to the reasons for that in just a moment. They're not being ignored. It's just the way we are proposing to approach the actual evaluation of kind of the technical work that is behind transaction. So I'll come to that in just a moment. Yes, is that a question?
Can we pause for a second? So I wonder if it makes sense to pause here for a second and let if any members of the committee or our visitors want to ask any questions at this point with the vision up there before we go next to how it will kind of boil down. Does that make sense? All right.
I do have a question.
Here, Wheeler, go for it.
A question and a statement. So the previous vision had this second paragraph after it that was very long, that talks about investments in the system will provide, et cetera, et cetera. Are you suggesting that we don't have that second paragraph any longer and it's incorporated somewhere else?
Yes, Chair Wheeler, thank you for raising that. It's brings me to a point I didn't mention. The second part of the current vision statement is more of a how statement than it is a vision statement. Right. And as such, it will definitely be included, as part of the evaluation, indeed, as part of how we actually assemble a project list to include in transactions. So, yeah, that's really the reason behind it. It's not so much that it's visionary as it's more descriptive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And my other, I just want to make sure I understood that was sort of going away. My other quick question is just a statement that some of the new measures are more qualitative than quantitative and are going to be difficult to measure, which isn't a bad thing. We still need to include them. It just makes it a little more difficult, I think, because they're more quantitative.
Thank you. If I may respond to that as well, you're spot on there. That is one of the considerations that we had in mind in the approach that I'm going to describe in just a moment. There is indeed some challenges within a long range transportation plan as to how you evaluate safety and equity. Resiliency is a little bit easier. Sustainability is kind of harder. And so you're quite right. There needs to be a mixture of kind of model-based outputs, which really drive the use of performance measures versus things that are more qualitative in nature, which might still be data-driven, but just not quite in the same way. And that is indeed a factor in kind of addressing how we're going to address this as part of the process to develop transactions. So I will return to that point in just a moment.
Mr. Wilson, this is Mary Hines.
Ms. Hines, yeah.
Hi, thank you. So Keith, I have first of all, on the safety issue, I would just point out that OIP has done a whole bunch around safety that may in fact be helpful with measures and things. So you might want to look at what the state has done. We've repurposed a lot of the highway safety improvement funds that come from the feds. So there may be some help there in that particular area. The thing I wanted to comment on most particularly is on slide 4, where you have described the new elements. And the place I got stuck in my reading and my understanding was on that second bullet under equity, where we use equitable in sort of the definition. And so the other ones I think are really crisp and clear. And we're all struggling with equity. So I don't mean to be cruel or anything, but I think we need to figure out what we're really trying to say here. Is it that we're going to provide opportunities for service that is accessible, affordable, and reliable and serves the needs of all, with particular focus on underserved? Or is it something else that, equitable access is a different thing than necessarily providing equity. And so I just highlight that. I think we need to be real clear what we're trying to say there, because I think it will drive the metric depending on how specific you want that to be. So those are my comments.
Yeah, I'm glad Ms. Hines raised that, because I actually had the same thing jumped out at me a little bit as well, and then you get into this kind of how does equitable service mean, particularly when it comes to transit service, does equitable service mean providing everyone the same level of service?
Oh.
That would not be equitable, particularly for some of the population. So yeah, I agree with you that maybe tweaking that language to I think we know what the intent is, but trying to arrive at a language that then we can measure is probably some good feedback that we need to get. So, all right, other comments?
Chair Wilson.
Mayor Rochelle.
Yeah, I agree with Ms. Hines. My concept of equity is accessibility, most particularly for everyone, but most particularly for vulnerable populations. And I think, some of us have been concerned for a very long time that not only technology, but technology as it's related to transportation has the potential to be exclusionary. And that's a concern that I have. I also wanted to ask a question in the resiliency, regards to resiliency. Does safety include, for example, evacuation during a crisis? Is that where we're going with this thought pattern?
Yes, if I may respond, actually, there's a couple of good points there, and if I could maybe just take them in order. To Ms. Hines, we'll certainly coordinate with the folks at OIP. We already have that on the to-do list. Not just for safety, but for equity as well. But thank you for saying that, and we're certainly planning to do that. And also thank you for pointing out the confusion by the kind of the double use of the words equity and equitable in the description of equity. And I agree that kind of needs to be addressed, and that actually speaks to the very last slide in this presentation, which we'll get to in just a moment. It really then, we're looking for feedback on what the committee members and authority members and others feel about what are the equity issues that we want transaction to address, because it is, as you've said, it means different things to different people. And I would say transaction cannot solve all the issues that surround equity. You have to recognise that the authority's primary roles and responsibilities, kind of relate to long-range transportation plan and a prioritisation of funding programs for regional transportation projects. And so, we have to think about it in ways that actually kind of result in actionable steps later in the process. So, but at the front end, there is a lack of clarity, I agree, and there is uncertainty and confusion. It's not really a big surprise because we've never approached it quite this way before. So we don't have anything to give you. We have lots of things we could give you from the research that we've done, but we don't really want to kind of pollute your thinking until we've heard from you if there are specific priorities that transaction and by extension the authority through its funding and other actions can address. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg here. And finally, to Mayor Rochelle's point about resiliency, certainly resiliency could include evacuations. One of the reasons, it makes it slightly easier for us to address resiliency is because previously through legislation from the 2012 session that we still refer to as HB 599 rather than specific code sections, but HB 599 did require the authority to go through a certain process with respect to evaluating projects prior to funding decisions. And although HB 599 did not specify specific measures, it did speak to kind of categories of things that should be considered in the evaluation under HB 599, and one of those was simply Homeland Security. And the approach that was taken back, I think, probably in 2013 and early 2014 was that to meet the requirements of HB 599 with respect to incorporating a Homeland Security measure, there was a measure chosen which really kind of addresses the resiliency of the system to deal with surges in traffic. Didn't say where the surges were coming from and going to, the kind of underlying implication that it was, I think, probably evacuations from downtown DC, but Homeland Security could mean many, many things, including shelter in place. And so we took an approach at that time that seemed to make the most sense, and it was a consensus-based approach that was ultimately approved by the authorities. So it's not like we just kind of randomly chose to do something, but that broader concept of the transportation system being able to cope with disruptions safely is very much at the heart of our thinking on what resiliency should do. So that's a very long answer to your very precise question.
And if I may follow up, I do recall that discussion, and I recall, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that at that time, I think the criteria that dealt with that was only rated or weighted at 5%, which at the time I did not feel was quite strong enough, but everybody else seemed to agree with 5%. So in essence, I was fine with it because everyone else was fine with it. But are we going to deal with it in that way, or how do you see this proceeding forward?
Okay. Well, at the risk of jumping too many steps into the future, there will need to be identification of measures, and for each measure there will need to be a weight, because the weights really demonstrate the priority that the authority wishes to place on certain things. In fact, Sri, if you could go back to slide 4, you will see the weights associated with each of the 15 measures, and Rochelle, you mentioned 5%. In fact, within what we did last time, you see the first measure, goal 2, safety of the transportation system, was weighted at 5%, and the Homeland Security measure that I was referring to is actually the 4th measure under goal 2, person hours of travel. Okay. Caused by 10% increase in PM peak demand, and that was also weighted at 5%. But you see the underlying problem with what we have right now is we have in total 15 measures, and when you have 15 measures, the weights have still got to add up to 100, and so you just dilute and dilute and dilute, and eventually, it's hard to kind of see without aggregating individual measures. It's hard to see what's important and what isn't. Now, the way it works out in practice is the congestion-related measures add up to about 45%, because in the past, the authority has felt that 45% was the appropriate weight to give in this part of the evaluation process. And that is something that will be revisited further down the road when it comes to whatever number of measures we end up with. We, by the way, are recommending that, not as part of this discussion, but it just generally in the discussions that we're having, is that we need to halve the number of measures. We need to get to 7 or 8 measures, which will really mean going through a difficult trade-off process. But it's only when you get down to 7 or 8 measures can you actually begin to apply meaningful weights to individual measures, rather than that kind of diluting process. But that is many months ahead of us. So you will certainly be involved when the time comes, but that time isn't now, because we don't. There's nothing we could do with that information right now. The transaction development process doesn't require that information until probably this time next year. And in any case, as I mentioned earlier, we do want to have a fairly significant round of public engagement over the kind of spring and summer of next year, 2021, in order to be able to get inputs from the public on how they feel about where the emphasis should lie, so that you have that information together with other analytical information from us before deciding what weights you do actually want to apply. So we'll give you the maximum amount of information we can before you have to make that decision, and it will be tough. And not everyone will agree, as Rochelle, you point out. We kind of took the process through three of the authorities committees plus the staff committee, the RJAC, and public inputs. And at the end of the day, when we did an averaging process, we looked at the averages, which kind of like to multiple decimal places of percents, and said, it doesn't make sense to have a weight of 3.1875 on one measure. So we at that point, we began to kind of round things to either 5 or 10%. based on a more exact averaging process, which is how we ended up with the 5 and the 10% weightings across 15 measures.
I understand that. Thank you very much. I think my thought at the time was, since it was specifically called out in legislation, that we might consider placing a greater emphasis on that. But thank you.
Chairman Wilson?
Thank you, Mayor Rochelle. And that was Mayor Meyer. Go for it.
Yes. Thank you, Chair Wilson. Following up on that question, I would begin by making an observation that we all intuitively know, but I want to verbalize that the members of the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, the jurisdictions are not monolithic, and we have differences between large and small, those close into the city and those further away. And some have as-built physical infrastructure that is fairly finite, and maybe they're at the 95% level in terms of build-out. And others may have much more open space, which would lead, for some jurisdictions, congestion relief in terms of adding more lanes or improving intersections. Whereas for smaller jurisdictions or those that are more built out, congestion relief takes on a different flavor or a nuance with respect to the addition of trails, improved pedestrian throughputs, and those kinds of things. And when the authority was first created was in 2013, I believe, the legislation 14 to be implemented, it was all about congestion relief. And as we talk now, 6, 7 years later, and we talk about equity, and particularly in terms of ensuring that our dollars are that projects that we fund have accessibility by persons of color and underserved populations and those who may not have had access to a variety of transportation systems. It may be that we would, in scoring, I think our performance measures and our scoring of projects and I know we want to reduce the number of categories, but for some jurisdictions, if they put a significant focus on social equity, that ought to, for those jurisdictions, the process by which we evaluate and rank projects ought to be equitable too, not exactly one for one, but in their totality, evaluated somewhat differently. And so I don't know how that could be accommodated in the process, particularly when we're trying to move forward with less categories, less measures, less scoring numbers, and trying to aggregate them. But we ought to be able to accommodate equity within that kind of assessment framework. I don't think that was very eloquently communicated by me, but that's the idea. That I don't think a jurisdiction should be penalized in some way if they put a significant emphasis upon social equity.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Meyer. I would agree completely. And I think going back to where Ms. Hines, I think, started this line of discussion, I want to try to steer us back, because I think there's a fundamental question that we all need to grapple with here, which, at least for me, there is. I think Mr. Jasper is right that we cannot, with one individual project, we're not going to be able to solve all of the inequities that exist in our community. But I do think there is a fundamental evaluation criteria where we go from a scenario where where we're just saying, okay, is this project exacerbating existing inequities or not, which is one bar that we have to clear, which hopefully we shouldn't be doing anything that's exacerbating existing inequities, to a question about whether the projects being weighed against each other are reparative to existing inequities that exist in the community. And I mean, my view personally is if we're going to put this language in here and we're going to say we're serious about equity, then we probably want to fall into that latter category where we're asking jurisdictions to show us how these projects are going to help address existing inequities as it relates to transportation and mobility. And that's something that we're going to hold folks accountable for in order to make our decisions. But I think that's a decision point for us, and I think it's probably inherent in how we wordsmith the vision statement, at least in my view.
Well, thank you, and I think we should just pause and reflect on that over the next few months as we move forward with this transaction. And you know, a pedestrian trail or a sidewalks or a bike sharing program from an affordable housing community to a metro rail or metro bus hub might be viewed somewhat differently in 2020 than it would have been 5 or 6 years ago.
Hey, Justin, this is Mary again.
Ms. Hines.
So I was thinking about this a little bit. I think, you know, Keith has got an approach for us. I think that's coming in the slide. I hope this conversation is helpful to him. But it strikes me that perhaps one thing that might help us in this conversation is to actually have some kind of a shared definition of the places that we're most concerned about, that where there is an accumulation, if you will, of people who have need of various sorts for, you know, or who are underserved. And I just wanted to share that I did some work with Conti at TPB, and they've recalculated the equity emphasis areas just for our side of the river. So not the whole DMV. It pops more things in Northern Virginia right now than is in the whole regional map. But it might be interesting to ask authority members and their staffs to reflect on those areas and whether, first of all, they agree with the analysis, but secondly, whether having some visual like that where then proposed projects are placed in proximity might also help us understand better who's going to be served by these proposed projects. And if this isn't the right definition, then what is our definition? Because there are tiny pockets, as you know, in Arlington and Alexandria where poor people live, that we're only going to get to with the kind of projects that Dave Meyer is talking about. But some of these other areas are very spread out, and it might lead us to different kinds of bus conversations or other supports beyond road widening that would be kind of new for the authority. So anyway, I just always find the geography incredibly helpful in my thinking, and maybe that's a place to start to ask ourselves, is this what we mean when we say we want equitable access?
Mr. Chairman.
Delegate Abraham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So one thing I just want to mention here is when we are dealing with equity and we're dealing with it in the context in terms of, you know, basically socioeconomic status, in terms of how much money do you have, you typically are dealing with pockets of poverty, right? We are typically dealing with clustered populations that live closely together. And that means that any plan that we're going to have to go forward, kind of in line with what Mayor Meyer was talking about here, is the idea that anything that we're going to do is going to inherently have to involve multimodal and or mass transit. And the reason for that is, even like, let's say even in Prince William County where I live, right? If you were looking in the central part of Manassas, along Sudley Manor Drive, for example, if you were looking in some of these other areas along Old Centerville Road, if you lived in one of those homes, and let's say you had to go up to Dulles for whatever reason, Maybe it's because that's where you work, or maybe it's because, or maybe you just happen to be able to catch flight, whatever it is. You're not getting a taxi up there and back combined for less than $120. It's not happening. And if you don't have a car, what are you supposed to do, right? And so the whole point is we would have to have a bus. My mom started working in Dallas in 1979. She retired this year. There's never been a bus that goes to Dallas to Manassas. And that in and of itself, I think is one of the problems that we have, is that if we don't have in the Western communities in Loudoun and Fairfax, or Loudoun, Western Fairfax and Prince William County, this emphasis on emerging BRT, the same way that we're dealing with the Route 1 corridor in Eastern Fairfax, for example, oftentimes it's because we don't have the actual infrastructure in place in order to put it, right? You have to have its own dedicated lane. And so these are some of the things that we have to think about here of, number one, let's improve the existing roads we have to make them accommodate multimodal and mass transit. And for mass transit, that could very much simply just include a BRT lane, right? If you're able to do it through an entire corridor and it makes sense for that area. And number two is keeping in mind that when you're dealing with these population clusters, in order for mass transit to work, you have to have a dedicated amount of ridership there in the first place. Because one of the things that we've seen in Eastern Prince William, for example, I know Chair Wheeler could speak to this even more than I could, is we will often have conversations about bringing down the blue line or bringing whatever there. But if we don't have the population density in those particular areas in order to serve it, it won't actually be financially viable to do it. And so this is one of those other things that we really, really have to think about in terms of the equity aspect of, which is, where does financial viability get in the way of constituent service? Because our priority has to be constituent service, while at the same time, we still have to, balance our budget. We still have to make our ends meet. So that's basically the main thing that I want to just highlight, is that when we're dealing with clustered populations of poverty, we are inherently dealing with multimodal and mass transit solutions in order to help out a lot more people.
Thank you, Delegate Rome. Other comments?
Yeah. Chair, Dave Snyder. So I want to address the other element of ESG, which is the E part of this, which will have potentially as dramatic a change in our planning and our execution of those plans as equity has. So if we're really serious about sustainability and resilience, that will make some fairly significant changes in what we do and how we do it. So just a note there that we've talked a lot about equity and equitable, which I fully agree with all the comments on, but I want to make the point that sustainable and resilience are not throwaway lines. They will require the same kind of change that equity will require in terms of what we do and the way we do it. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilmember Snyder. Other comments, questions? Okay, Mr. Jasper, we rudely interrupted your presentation, so I'll let you get back to it.
No, this is fabulous. This is actually exactly the discussion we wanted to have with slide 7. So you've excelled yourselves. I appreciate that greatly. I think many of those were comments rather than questions, and so I won't at this time. If unless there's anything particularly you want me to respond to, what I would just say kind of more generically is, if we could go to slide 6, just for starters, let me explain how we are thinking about approaching things, and to Councilmember Snyder's comment right at the end there, if we're serious about and I say we, I mean you, are serious as an authority about addressing equity, sustainability, and resilience. This will change what we do and how we do it, and I couldn't agree more. Which is why we wanted to put this on the table now. It is a 1 in 5 year opportunity to discuss these items and come up with an approach. And it will be impossible to do everything. I mean, that's about the only guarantee I can give you, unfortunately, at the front end of this. But what I'll also guarantee is that we will give everything the most serious thought and with great diligence and kind of share with you, the strengths and weaknesses of different approaches and consequences. I would also say, just as a generic response to what was the comments that were made, is that the current transaction project list, which is, if you like, the first eligibility screen for what the authority can fund, doesn't guarantee any of the projects in the project list will be funded. It simply means they are eligible for use of regional revenues through your 6-year program process. There's 352 projects in that project list across the region, and since 2017, when that transaction project list was adopted by the authority, I think you've probably allocated a couple of $2 billion to some of those projects. But I would say, many of the projects that have some potential to address equity, sustainability, and resilience are already in the project list. The challenge becomes, which ones do you want to fund? So it may not be as hard as it might at first seem, but I do agree there probably needs to be a revisiting of your process. And the final generic statement I would make is that the thing that ultimately constrains what you can do is the wording of the Virginia Code. We have to be consistent with what we are allowed and not allowed to do. And obviously, you're probably familiar with much of that. But if at any point we need counsel to weigh in, then I'm sure Ms. Backman will facilitate that conversation as well. But that is kind of like an overarching constraint in some respects. But within that constraint, there is a lot of flexibility, I believe, to consider the things we're proposing to you. So, with all of that said, on slide 6. We are looking at how, at a very high level, how we are thinking right now about what the vision and goals and subsequently the objectives and measures will as to how we go about the transaction planning process. I do not know at this stage how many projects are going to be in transaction. So for the sake of argument, let's just say 350, because that's broadly what's already in there. It may be more, it may be less. And what we do to evaluate that group of projects, because we cannot evaluate them individually. There's just too many of them. We do not have the scope, the schedule, the budget to do a detailed evaluation of each of them. So we kind of have to adopt an approach of grouping projects, which is going to make it challenging. At the get-go, but if we know what we want to do, then we can adjust our process to reflect what we want to accomplish. So there are 2 basic approaches that we can use towards evaluating the projects that are in transaction. The traditional approach, or the approach that we use for the current transaction, is what we kind of within the industry called performance-based planning, which essentially means that you as we've talked about, you identify measures, you give weights to those measures, and then you kind of throw everything into a transportation simulation model, and let the model kind of decide how the different projects perform compared to the base situation with nothing new in, just essentially the existing system, and see how different projects perform against the measures that are of most importance to you. So we will certainly replicate that for the measures that we have. The performance measures themselves generally work best if they are measures that allow themselves to be analyzed through a transportation simulation model. It's not to say that is the only way to do it, and indeed the 15 measures in the current transition plan, I recall 3 of them could not actually be analysed directly through the model. So we do what's known as off-model analysis, which is a little bit more kind of complex and makes transparency a little bit harder because we can't just show the model results. But it's something we can do. So that's the first kind of component to our approach. The second component, which is to be honest quite radically new for us, is I'm referring to as a core value approach, where the authority, primarily through the vision statement, really identifies the core values that you want transaction to keep in mind throughout. And so the core value approach is something that's much more holistic and overarching, and actually lends itself, if for a number of reasons, towards looking at safety, equity, and sustainability in particular. The reason I say that is because that kind of approach allows you to apply, principles of safety, principles of equity, however they are defined, and principles of sustainability across everything that's in transaction. Whereas the measures, they are very specific and they look just to how a group of projects affects that measure. The core value approach means we can look to see how all of the projects are likely to affect your core values. Now, core values, I mentioned in the second sub-bullet under the core value approach, is kind of broader based and it's somewhat more qualitative in nature. But that doesn't mean it's not data driven. And Ms. Hines made an excellent point a few minutes ago about TPB's equity emphasis areas model and how they've tweaked it for Northern Virginia. So that is a very data-driven tool that actually allows you to look through multiple layers in a GIS system at different categories of what could refer to as disadvantaged populations at quite a micro level. So you can actually see for different sorts of disabilities or other definitions that you want to use of inequity, you can see where the parts of the region are where those situations are occurring. So you immediately across the entire region get an insight as to potentially the equity areas that you might want to address. So that's a valuable tool that's available right now. It's very data driven. And using a core value approach for equity, if it works out this way, is we could actually start the entire transaction process by looking at those equity emphasis areas and actually beginning to develop projects to include in transaction, or at least validate projects that would otherwise be in transaction, to kind of build a relationship between the equity emphasis areas and the projects that might help the equity emphasis areas. But to Delegate Rome's point about the bus from Manassas to Dulles, knowing the individual pockets of poverty are tells you part of the picture, but it doesn't tell you the whole picture. So we need to understand travel demand from a larger perspective, and we need to see if maybe there are other pockets of poverty along the line of a potential bus route or transit service from Manassas to Dulles or wherever the data takes us. So these tools and applying them at a core value basis across the region as a whole, I think is going to be much more likely to identify at the front end of the analysis, what projects are needed and where they are and what specifically equity issues are we trying to address, and then kind of map all that stuff together so that when we actually get to the end of the process, we can actually summarize that. And I think, transaction, you may recall, is a fiscally unconstrained plan. It's also, to a certain extent, a geographically unconstrained plan in that it extends beyond the borders of Northern Virginia. But the analysis that's in transaction is going to flow into your subsequent 6-year programming cycles. And so this sort of analysis is available to you when you're presented with a set of candidate projects. We can do the analysis, as we always do, to present to you the qualitative and quantitative factors. And then it becomes a decision for you as to, you as the authority, as to how you want to base your funding decisions going forward. But there's going to need to be structure around it. I don't want to make it sound as though it's going to be really easy, because it isn't going to be really easy at all. But I do believe we have the tools available, and this combination of performance-based planning, which is more traditional, and the values approach, where it's more of a holistic approach where you look across the entire network, and then you combine those two things together at the end. I think we will be able to accomplish what we're setting out to achieve here. At the end of the day, however, the funding decisions are your decisions. We can't make those for you. We can provide you with the data. We can give you the analysis. But how you choose to allocate the resources is obviously always going to be your decision. I would say both of these two processes or approaches will include the public engagement and stakeholder inputs that we're looking to gather during the late spring and over the summer of 2021. And so the decision making on some of this stuff is in fall of next calendar year. I don't know if that's helped at all, or given you some reassurance at least that we're kind of trying to embrace the points that you're raising. I don't think I've heard anything which gives me pause that the approach we're outlining here is not appropriate. I think it actually reinforces my thinking that this is a good way forward. I'm happy to pause again there if there are any.
I was going to say this is probably a good place to pause again. So I want to give the members of the committee an opportunity to, I guess, articulate any thoughts or ask any questions again. All right, everyone is in wild concurrence with the comments that Mr. Jasper just voiced. All right. All right, why don't we move to you wanted to frame a fundamental question here on the last slide here?
Yeah, please. So just simply, essentially a blank piece of paper with a question. What are the most urgent equity issues pertinent to the region that should be considered in transaction? This is not a definitive list. It won't be exhaustive, and it won't be the last opportunity to talk about it. It's the first of many opportunities to talk about it. But if there are top of mind concerns from from your own communities, from jurisdictions and constituencies, that you just know today, that they're there, and you think they have some nexus with transaction, the transportation related or potentially indirectly transportation related, then we would love to kind of get a first read on these. As I say, we in our own minds we have thoughts about where we would go with this, but I don't want to constrain your thinking to what we think as staff.
Okay, open it up again.
Chair Wilson.
Mayor Rochelle.
I have heard from a number of Manassas Park residents that they would like better bus service. They would like a more complete routes, that they would like the buses to go to more places. Right now, folks really cannot get to the supermarket, to their doctor appointment, to their eye appointment. They can't get to the very most basic places the basic destinations where they need to go. So I do hear often about bus service, bus stops, routes, things of that nature. Thank you, Chair Wilson.
Thank you, Mayor Rochelle. Other thoughts? Chair Wheeler.
So I was actually just sort of piggybacking on this, and I really don't know whether it actually sort of falls under this purview anyway, but it's the idea that we have put forth a lot of commuter bus service and sort of long haul, bus rapid transit kind of things in the area, but it's the internal getting around in Prince William County that makes it hard. There's no jitney service. There's no things to connect short haul things. It's been done at the expense of sort of the long haul and, moving people more quickly in buses. And I don't really even know how it would fit into transaction, but it's an issue if we're talking about equity that people can't take a bus to go to Moresby. I think we've tried to handle those problems with an old set of tools, and we need to develop a new set of tools and modes of transportation to be able to handle that. And I sort of beyond the scope of what I don't know exactly what to suggest, but it is an issue in Prince William County.
Yeah, and I guess I would suggest, just from my perspective, that in some ways the pandemic has shined a light and exacerbated some of the funding equities within modes. I think we had our last meeting, we had a lot of conversation about what the ridership impacts have been across modes, and in some ways that does very much accentuate some of those disparities in investment. And I think we've already been having this conversation around the bus regionally and how we increase investment, enhance service around bus service. And I think that's certainly what we heard from Mayor Rochelle, and I think it is inherent in some of the comments Chair Wheeler made as well, that I think that investment disparity is probably going to need to be addressed, and that's going to be part of the equity conversation for sure. Other comments?
Mayor Wilson, it's Mary Hines.
Yep. Go for it.
This bus is high on my list as well, and certainly dedicated transit lanes, sort of agnostic about what form that transit takes. I certainly would allow carpools to ride in bus, in transit lanes to try to move more people more quickly. But it does raise for me this question of, our charge says that we're about reducing congestion and increasing capacity. And some of what I would think of as local bus service may over time become very hard to defend. The difference between buying a bus and having the money to run the bus are two really different conversations. And so I guess I raise this only to put it on the table as something potentially we may want to ask for a tweak in our legislation as transaction moves forward. We should keep our eye on those kinds of things where slightly more permission, given how far we're into this program, might let us really meet the needs of our community better and use their tax dollars to provide the services they're looking for.
Well, and I would tack on that in some of this, it's also some of the inequity is around the type of commute. We have to Chair Wheeler's point earlier, I think we have facilitated in the past for quite a while the long haul commute from outer suburbs or any suburb really to the District of Columbia, and that's been how a lot of our transit investment has been focused on. But that leaves behind those folks who have the intra-jurisdictional commutes, the non-traditional hours commutes, all of those not traditional commutes. And I think the pandemic has again highlighted that, because a lot of the traditional commutes, I was just back at my day job office on Friday downtown, and it's a ghost town, and And I think that is going to be the reality for a while. But I think it also shows that, you know, the folks on those non-traditional commutes still very much are trying to get around, and we do not have an infrastructure in this region that's designed to support that, and that is a significant inequity.
Right, but MVTA has not paid for operations, Justin.
Sure.
And I don't think we actually can under how we understand it now.
Yep.
So if we buy buses, somebody's still got to run the buses, and that's the big cost. The bus is in many ways incidental to running the cost of running the bus for 20 years or 10 years or whatever the life of the bus is.
Well, I'm not sure I completely agree with that. I mean, obviously, rolling stock is not an insignificant cost. And then to your point, you know, the dedicated transitway. I mean, Alexandria is building 3 dedicated transitways, with 1 in place, and we got 2 more coming. The costs of those are not insignificant either. So, I mean, I hear you that yes, the operational costs are a big part of this too, but there's significant capital costs associated with all this too.
I know, but if we build it and we can't run it, that's a problem. That's my only point. We need to think, and honestly, if we can't maintain it, that's a problem too. So it's the whole cluster of those things that really matters in keeping the system robust and strong.
Not disagreeing at all. Yeah, no, I agree with him. Okay, other comments?
Mr. Chair, Dave Snyder, just a couple more. Here's a concrete example of what we can do in terms of equity. If you look at bus stop after bus stop in this region, it's a sign standing sometimes on the side of the road where there isn't even pavement. Now, if that's not second-class treatment of the bus system, I don't know what is. So, you know, one of the things we've tried to do locally is put a lot of money into simple things like bus shelters so that people have a place to stay out of the elements. And I think there's going to be a huge amount of looking at how we come up with something that's more flexible, that meets the very needs that we've talked about tonight, but also has to do it in a cost-effective manner. So I think the challenge is there. I will say we also are going to have to layer on top of this much greater climate risk analysis, what the system is contributing to climate risk overall, and what particular components are contributing to climate risk, and how we reduce that risk system-wide, as well as individual components, which also need to be hardened and made more resilient. So just as this discussion has started very reasonably with equity, we're going to have a very similar challenging discussion. But I think the criteria that we've used so far are the product of a particular time and a particular socioeconomic political environment. And as Abraham Lincoln once said, as the case changes, so our thinking must change. So just a couple thoughts there might be relevant to this discussion and others. Thanks.
Sorry about that. I was muted. Thank you, Councilmember Snyder. Other comments from anyone? Mr. Jasper, does that give you what you were looking for as far as some issues there for consideration?
Yes, so this is very, very, very helpful start for us, just to get our minds focused around some of the things which, you know, most concern members of the committee. So this is a good start for us. But as I said earlier, I do assure you that we will interact with you frequently on this through the transaction process, so that as Member Snyder just quoted, I think it was Lincoln, as things change, so our thinking must change. I think that's kind of where, as staff, we find ourselves at this particular moment in time. But I do appreciate the comments on the legislation. That really has to be something that we work within. So that's something we'll obviously talk about more moving forwards. I just wanted to circle back to the the vision statement.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you're looking for us to adopt the vision statement formally. Is that correct? And make the recommendation to the full board?
That's correct. If I may, by way of background, we have had this similar discussion with the Technical Advisory Committee and the Planning Coordinating Advisory Committee over the last couple of weeks. The Technical Advisory Committee, I'm not sure they exactly voted on the vision, but they kind of made a statement about essentially endorsing that, but they want to kind of separate from the goals. I don't think they've felt quite comfortable where they were with where we were with the goals, and that's absolutely fine. The PCAC last week did take action and unanimously voted in support of recommending the vision as worded to the authorities. So, if that helps you in your thinking, then that's good. If you feel you want to kick it around a bit longer, then this is not ultra time sensitive, but it is a landmark we have to pass to keep moving forward. So, if you're ready to move forward, then that would be great too.
Okay. So I guess back to the committee, is there a motion to approve the proposed or to recommend the proposed vision that we're looking at on our screen here?
I'll move, Snyder.
There's a motion by Councilmember Snyder. Is there a second?
Second by Rochelle.
Second by Chair Wheeler. I saw Chair Wheeler's hand first. Go with Chair Wheeler. Second by Chair Wheeler. Not Chair Rochelle, sorry. I've combined you two now into one. All right, seconded by Chair Wheeler. Is there any further discussion on the motion? All right, hearing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those
Aye.
nay. The ayes have it. We have recommended that vision to the full board. Any further things you're looking for from us, Mr. Jasper?
I do not have anything else for you this evening. Ms. Backman may have some update items.
That's the next item. Okay, so thank you very much for that presentation, and thanks to the committee and the other members of the board who are here for the great discussion. All right, let's move now to the NVPA update. I'll turn it over to Ms. Bassman.
Thank you, Chair Wilson. I will be brief, just noting that you do have an authority meeting next week. We will receive the FY 2020 audit presentation from PB Mayors, and we have several other presentations. Number one being the presentation on the I-495 Next project, the I-495 American Legion Bridge Transit/TDM study update. And we will also get a presentation on the VTrans update. This is very important. The Commonwealth is in the process of updating VTrans, and there is a synergy between VTrans and SmartScale. So all of these presentations are timely, considering that all of them, if they're not currently, they all will be out for public comment for the I-495 Next, the Transit TDM component, and of course, VTrans. Lastly, we will have a discussion, and this will serve as your first read of the draft 2021 legislative program. Just as a reminder, the Governance and Personnel Committee will be at 5:30 prior to the start of the authority meeting. And Mr. Chair, that's all I have.
Okay. Any questions for Ms. Backman? All right. That is our final item. We do not have the next meeting set, do we? We're going to circulate that date, or do we?
Chair, since I had proposed a few dates, we didn't confirm any one of them. We need to meet, we could meet either November 27th, Friday, November 30th, Monday, or December 1st, Tuesday.
Okay, and those are dates you circulated to everyone already or not?
I think I did it earlier, but I don't think any one of you got a chance to review it and get back to me.
Okay, so I guess we don't need to sort that out right now, but everyone, if you have a chance to look at your calendar and provide back to Sri the dates that work for you, and we will lock that date in. Okay.
Chair Wilson, what were those dates again? I apologize.
Rochelle, I will send you an email to every one of you.
Okay, thank you.
I would note that November 27th is the day after Thanksgiving, so
Yeah,
probably
thank you.
won't include that.
Yeah, that's probably going to be
Not
hard.
gonna work.
Sure.
All right. Any other discussion? Any other business? All right. Hearing none, I hope everyone has a great Thanksgiving, and we will get a date set and enjoy Election Day. And I hope it works out however you want it to work out. And we'll see you soon. Thanks, everyone. See you.
Thanks.